Hi, it's me again, Pat Stewart at Hames and Axel Farm in my great unfinished studio. Um, I started the other day in talking about bloat, and I mentioned polio, and then I never did the second class or the second session. So here's the second session. What is polio? Now, first off, please recognize that I'm not a vet. So when I speak about things, I'm speaking about things from the experience that I have had, that I have read and learned from others. Um, but polio is definitely something that if you have a vet, you need to call a vet in on. Okay, what is polio? It is not a contagious disease among goats like it is among humans. It is not contagious from goats to humans. So relax about that. But when we hear polio, because of our human experience with polio, we get very scared. If goats could understand the word polio, they would get very scared, but for a very different reason. So, polio is short for encephalopoliomyelitis, which has to do with an inflammation of the brain. But that's a very long word, and polio is a lot easier to say. What it has to do with is the lack of thiamine in the goat's brain. And just like we have essential vitamins that we need, thiamine or vitamin B1 is a vitamin which they can actually get from their food if they can process their food. But because bloat stops the processing of food, it starves the brain of thiamine. So when an animal gets bloat, yes, it's good. It gets a bellyache. It definitely gets uncomfortable. It can distend to the point of rupture, although that's very rare. But it often leads to the next step, which is polio. Polio can kill. I have seen animals recover from polio, so it's not a death sentence, but it is an intensive regimen of trying to get that animal back on its feet, literally. Because one reason it's called polio is it does cause difficulty with movement. Um, it is encephalo, it's a brain illness, but it has to do with connections from the brain to the rest of the body. Um, it might be the digestive tract, it might be something else, but it manifests by things like droopy ears, paralysis in the face. If a goat is down and they begin to pin their head either back against their belly or up like this and backwards, those are all polio signs. Um, the first thing you need to do is to call a vet and let them know what you're dealing with. And you should keep some thiamine, some for vitamin B1, or at least fortified vitamin B complex around your farm, because chances are the vet's going to say to you, "It sounds like polio. Give them a shot." Your vet will tell you what the dosage that you should use is. It is given subcutaneously, not IV, unless your vet says otherwise. Do not give anything intravenously unless you've been trained by a vet in order to do it. Um, but luckily, most of our medicines that we give to goats, we actually give just under the skin. Um, we want to do what we need to do to get their body functioning again, which means cut out the grain, get them back to forage, and try to help them keep moving. If they're down and they can't move, then we need to make sure that their food is where they can get to it, that they are hydrated. Either they can drink on their own or we give them water. I saw a doe who, and to tell you how fast this can happen, this was an acquaintance of mine's doe who actually she had gone to a show and she left her husband in charge of the herd while she was gone. He was not a big fan of the goats, but he wanted to help out. Um, he just decided that he didn't want to go to the feed store and get more hay though, so he upped the amount of grain he gave them instead of the amount of hay that he gave them. So he threw a flake of hay to them in the morning, and then by evening there was no flake left to give, so just give them some extra grain. Then by morning the dough was down, and she stayed down, and she stayed down, and she stayed down, and she stayed down for 3 weeks. Her ear was droopy, she appeared to be blind in one eye, or at least partially. She was immobile. She was put into a crate so that she could be safe. She held on. When her owner got home, her owner spent a lot of time with her, gave her water, syringed her into her mouth, gave her hay, gave her vitamin B shots on a regular basis, much more frequently than once a day, um, and consulted with a vet, and they got that goat through to the point when she was 3 weeks after she came down, and 21 days after she came down with the polio, she stood up, and there was a fully formed udder underneath her. Nobody had realized that she was pregnant during this whole time. And she held those babies and she delivered, I believe they were triplet does. And she recovered very quickly once she no longer had to house those babies because she was giving whatever food she had to the babies that nobody even knew were there. So that's how much a goat loves their kids. That doe wound up standing up and walking. She always had a little bit of a droop to an ear, but she went on to have several more babies and be very healthy. Um, and I was grateful that I could at least watch them. It wasn't my responsibility. It was a doe that was born and born at my farm, but there's some points you just have to walk away and say it's their responsibility. I advised where I could, but the big thing is we don't need to be worried about polio or worried about bloat if we understand how to feed and if we understand what to look for if an animal is suffering. Um, and if I wasn't clear in the last thing, let me explain to you that if you think something might be wrong with your goat, if you haven't seen it poop or pee, especially poop, if you haven't seen it burp and burp out more cud, if it seems like it just swallowed a basketball, if it's grinding its teeth, if its hair are standing on end because it's trying to trap warm air against its body, if it's got its head pressed against the wall, if it's off by itself where it's usually with somebody else, if it's quiet when it's usually playful, all of those are signs that something's wrong with that goat and you should call a vet. Okay? So when we talk about how important it is to feed, and people kind of give it a half an ear to listening, it's really important that you pay attention to what they get fed, how much they get fed, how often they get fed, and then to get fed the right foods. And then once an animal has had polio, it's predisposed to having it again. So we need to monitor really carefully any any greens, fresh grasses, fresh leaves, fresh or overly sweet treats or grains, all of which could make that stomach go all happy again, and the brain would then suffer from the polio again. So this is something that just come up a couple times in conversation with this year's buyers. This year seems to be more concerned about it than previous years, but I think that's good because a lot more people have goats and are buying goats this year than in the past. And I think they're being more aware of what they need to know. And I hope that little videos like this help with that learning curve. Okay, more will come as I think they need to happen. So stay well and love your goats. Bye.